put me on the spot. Thank you very, very much, Adise and the other ladies of the Oromo Women's Association for inviting me to this launch. The role of Oromo women in the future of the Oromo people has been very much underestimated, especially by Oromo men. The power tends to have been invested in the male side of Oromo society since the Oromo people were overran in the 1800s. And it has been the nature of men to compete for power and to talk, and it has been the nature of women to cooperate and do and to achieve. We've all seen this in the Oromo liberation movement. There have been fighters of both sexes. Most of the violence has been committed by men, but women have been subjects of that violence, objects of that violence, as much as men, but they've also had to share in other forms of violence which the men have not. I think it is vitally important that all the women join the Oromo Women's Association in this country and elsewhere, and that the men support this organisation. There are differences between the sexes. Men tend to be more violent, and women tend to cooperate more than men do. If we're going to get agreement amongst Oromo people, then it is vital that the women are empowered more than they have been up to now. As I said, men are good at talking, but women are good at doing. Now, I'm going to have to go through my notes here, pretending that I've got a PowerPoint presentation, and I will describe the pictures to you. One of my favourite pictures is of a meeting in Dadaab refugee camp, where there is a table like this, and I put my chair on one side of the table, and in front of me are all the men. And there is one man, usually with a beard. He's waving his arms a lot, and he speaks for hours and hours and hours, telling me about the problem of the Oromo and the history and this sort of thing, but really nothing new. Whereas behind, there are the women listening. And what I did at that meeting was to take my chair from this side of the table and put it on that side of the table and turn my back to the men and spoke to the women. I tried during my trips to Kenya, Djibouti, Somaliland, South Africa and Egypt to speak to at least as many men as many women as I spoke to men. Now, in some places that was difficult, not only because men tend to want to act as spokespeople and not allow the women to be heard, but also because in South Africa and in South Africa and Egypt, the majority of the refugees were men, so it was difficult to get an equal number of men and women in those places. But overall, I interviewed 187 people, and 85 of those were women. And what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about is the abuses faced by those women. As I said earlier, women in Oromo society tend to face the same abuses as men, and for the same reasons. I have a nice picture of Asli Oromo, who you know, Galasa, from the East. She was a fighter in the East, and I've spoken to men who fought under Asli when she was in command of a group of soldiers in the East. She was arrested in 1991 along with a lot of other Oromo people. She was shot in the chest and she was put in prison for 18 years before she was let out. She was initially sentenced to death. And when she was released, she was expected to support the EPRDF in the 2010 elections, which she refused to do and had to flee to Kenya, where I interviewed her. So, and women like Asli, as I say, have suffered the same abuses as the men: detention, torture, disappearance, killing. In addition to that, women have suffered because of the men that they are associated with. In addition to the torture, of which Ethiopia is in the top division internationally, out of the 187 refugees I interviewed, over half of them, 51%, had been tortured. Now, in most populations of refugees, between 5 and 35% of refugees give a history of torture. In the Oromo case, this is over 50%, which is very high. That puts Ethiopia among the top countries for torturing people in the world. This year, Amnesty International is going to focus on torture, and I'm hoping that we'll get more exposure of Ethiopia because of this. As I say, women tend to be abused not only because of their own involvement, but because of the men that they're associated with. I met many women who had been imprisoned, beaten, tortured and raped because their husbands or their brothers or their fathers had been associated with the Oromo Liberation Front or suspected of such association. However, I don't think I saw one case of where a man had been detained because his wife was associated with the Oromo Liberation Front. Only one. Whereas there were many, many of the women I spoke to who had been detained, tortured, raped because their male relatives had been associated with the OLF. Rape is used as a tool of oppression and almost in a casual way when arresting other members of the family or after members of the family have been taken into detention. I spoke to one woman who was raped by the Kabele chairman a few weeks after her husband had been detained for the third time, and then she was raped 4 years later when in Kakuma refugee camp by a TPLF security agent. I spoke to a Muslim Amhara lady whose brother and father had run off to join the Ethiopian Patriotic Front early on after the TPLF took power. Soldiers came to her house, took away her mother who disappeared, and she was 14 years old at the time, and then they raped her. Another woman, another Amhara woman, was 10 or 11 years old when all of her family were taken away and put in prison, and she was again raped all night by TPLF soldiers. I have, well, half a dozen instances of women that were raped at their homes because of their brothers, husbands, fathers' involvement with the OLF. There's one lady who I particularly remember in Kakuma camp called Abiba, 4 weeks after her husband was taken into detention and was made to disappear in detention, 8 soldiers came to her compound, and they took her and her 1-year-old twins out into the bush, and these 8 soldiers raped her for 4 hours with the babies nearby. And stupidly I said, well, what did you do after that? She said, quite crossly and rightly so, when you've been raped by 8 men for 4 hours, you can't do anything. And in fact, she was found the next morning by her neighbours who came to look for her. Many women are raped as a form of torture during interrogation when they are detained, suspected of involvement or trying to get information about their husbands or brothers or fathers' involvement with the OLF. I have dozens of these women that I was going to show you pictures of who've been raped many times by many people in detention as part of the interrogation and torture process. And just like torture, it is a way of destroying a personality, disempowering them, removing their sense of self and their ability to even like themselves. It's a very powerful form of damage to do to a person. Similar to torture, but worse than torture in many ways, because it's a personal violation, which torture is not necessarily to the same extent. And even when they escape from the abuse they've suffered in Ethiopia, women are still not safe. I spoke to several women who were raped by traffickers on their way to Egypt, on their way to South Africa, and on their way elsewhere. One young girl I interviewed in South Africa was raped repeatedly for a whole year while she was kept in the bush by a trafficking agent when trying to get to South Africa from Kenya. Another one described how 3 in her party died during a 9-month journey to South Africa, and she herself narrowly avoided being raped by one of the traffickers. The worst case I saw was of 2 young girls who were 15 and 13 when I spoke to them in Egypt. At the ages of 10 and 12, they had escaped from Ethiopia. The 10-year-old, named Samira, both her parents were killed when she was very young, and she was being looked after by one of her mother's relatives. But they were so harassed by the authorities that they had to flee when she was, as I say, 10 years old. The other girl was 10, Nusria, was 12. Her brother was arrested after her father and older brother had been killed. Another brother was arrested and he escaped from detention. And soldiers came to her home when she was 12 years old and said, if you don't produce your brother, we're going to put you in prison for the rest of your life. And so she fled. And Nusria and Samira were part of a group of 35 who were trying to cross Sudan to get to Ethiopia, to get to Egypt. This group of 35 refugees were attacked by Rashida tribesmen and captured, taken to the Sinai desert, where they were tortured, and the traffickers, these Rashida, tried to extort money from them. They were told to phone relatives or friends abroad and come up with $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. Otherwise they would be killed. Those that could not come up with the money were subject to more and more torture over the period of 2 or 3 years. These 2 girls, a group of 35 to begin with, dwindled as some produced the money and were allowed to go off to Israel. Others who didn't produce the money were tortured to death, including Samira's relative who was looking after them. She was electrocuted to death. The amount of rape that these two girls at the ages of 10 and 12 were subjected to increased over those 2 or 3 years as the number of the other people in the group either left, died, or were tortured to death. Samira was almost buried alive. They thought she was dead because she was so weak and emaciated, and then they realised she was still breathing. Nusria and Samira had to bury 4 men whose kidneys were harvested. The theory is that if you can't afford the money, then we will sell your kidneys. And they told me how they witnessed 4 men being killed and their kidneys being harvested, and they were told to bury the dead bodies of these men. When they arrived in Cairo in January 2013, they were extremely thin. I have pictures. And they were emaciated and very weak and covered in scars. Scars from burns, from molten plastic being dripped on their body, and stab wounds with knives where they'd been tortured, just so they could make sure that they didn't have any relatives that they could contact for money. There was a scar on Nusria's forearm where they'd poured petrol on and set fire to it. There was a scar on one of her ankles, which I've got a photograph of. And that scar is from wearing shackles for 2 years in the Sinai Desert. Fortunately, those 2 young girls are now on the road to recovery. They've gained weight and they are able to smile, which is wonderful to see. But obviously they're very scarred individuals. I've interviewed women who faced abuse in the countries where they've tried to claim asylum. It's difficult enough in Western countries, as you well know, getting asylum. It's hard enough in relatively civilized places like Kenya to have protection. We all know of people who've been snatched by Ethiopian security agents and taken back to Ethiopia, in particular Tesfahun Chemedo, who was killed in prison in August last year. But the difficulties faced by all refugees, and especially women, in Somaliland, in Djibouti, in South Africa and in Egypt, is especially severe. I spoke to 2 women in Djibouti who had been raped by Djibouti citizens when trying to work as housemaids and other menial tasks in Djibouti, and walking back home at night through Djibouti city had been set upon twice, including when she was pregnant from the first rape, and raped by Djibouti citizens. One had been severely mutilated with a knife during the process as well. I spoke to one young girl, 23-year-old, just a few days before I left Johannesburg, who had been raped 4 days before I spoke to her. She was walking to work at 7:30 one Sunday morning along a main street in Johannesburg when she was set upon by 2 South Africans. One of them held a gun to her and the other one dragged her to the floor and raped her. And they said, "You Somalis and Ethiopians are safe, meaning you don't have AIDS, so you'll be fucked every time," they said. I spoke to one girl who was abducted by sexual predators in Cairo and taken away for, I think it was 3 weeks, while she was repeatedly raped. She'd also been raped in Ethiopia. And she was a psychological mess, I have to say. Right. I don't want to leave you with the impression that women refugees are only victims. They're not. Some of the most impressive people I've met doing these interviews with refugees in these different countries, the most impressive people I've met have been women. There's a very dynamic young lady in Kakuma camp who's responsible for running a women's refugee organisation, responsible for research with international NGOs, and responsible for microfinance projects amongst the refugee women in Kakuma. A woman who was 60 last year, who works as an unofficial traditional health worker in Kakuma camp. She told me her story. When her husband was detained and disappeared in 2004, she was detained shortly afterwards for several months. When she was released, the whole family property had been confiscated and destroyed, and her 8 children were in different relatives' homes. She gathered together her 8 children, and with them she hitchhiked to the border, and then hitchhiked to Nairobi, and she supported her 8 children while living in a mosque in Nairobi for 2 years before she found out about UNHCR, the refugee agency. Then she was taken to Kakuma, and she sold part of her food ration so that she could buy school books, pencils and pens for her children so they could go to school in Kakuma. And that woman had a real presence about her. I was very impressed with her. I spoke to a lady from the Ogaden whose family had been awfully abused. She'd lost, I think, 6 relatives who'd been killed by the regime, and she'd witnessed the rape and killing of a 14-year-old girl from her village. But she was held in detention for 17 months in a military camp in Godey, in the Ogaden, in Somali region. She was held in this cell, just let out for about 20 minutes each day in order to go to the toilet. And this cell was so small that she couldn't stand up and she couldn't lie down. She could only sit. And she wasn't even allowed out to pray during that time. She escaped and then walked in the desert for 3 days before finding a village and getting some help from other people. And then she walked with other people fleeing the Ogaden to Somalia, where she survived in Kismayo in Al-Shabaab. Came to Kismayo and took it over. And then she got to Dadaab camp. She worked there, saved some money, and then eventually got a boat from Mombasa down to Mozambique, and from there she got to South Africa. So lots of fantastic, powerful and resourceful women. And they are glad for their voices to be heard, and with organisations like the Oromo Women's Association, I hope that we will be able to tell these women's stories in more places and to more people, not just Oromo but non-Oromo. So thank you very much.